Have you ever asked yourself why maple syrup costs so much? You ever think that it might be cheaper to make your own? Well, in part 3 of the Sugaring While Black series, I'm going to answer those questions and tell you how much it costs me to make my own maple syrup. Let's go. The first thing you need in order to make homemade maple syrup is to know what you're looking for. There are lots of different species of maple trees, but sugar maples are prized for the high sugar content of their sap. Also, sugar maples only grow in a certain part of North America, here. So if you live outside this region, unfortunately, making homemade maple syrup is not going to be possible. But if you do live in this region, identifying sugar maples can be a little bit tricky. You've probably seen the basic shape of a maple leaf. So when I'm looking for sugar maples, I look for this shape, but also a couple of other things. I look for leaves that are completely green on both the front and back side, stems that are yellow, green, or yellowish green in color, and bark that looks like this. If you find maple trees that have leaves that are purple or silver on the underside, then you're probably not looking at a sugar maple. Okay, so you live in a region where there are sugar maples and you found sugar maples. Awesome. But when do you tap these trees for maple syrup? Sugaring season usually begins in late winter, when the temperature at night drops below freezing and then during the day climbs above freezing. This is the temperature that trees use to begin mobilizing sugars from their roots to their branches to grow leaves for the upcoming spring. It's really important that you select trees that can handle the stress of being tapped for harvesting maple sap. Select trees that are at least 20 inches in diameter and trees that are healthy. So once you have a solid week of nights below freezing and days above freezing, that's a good time to begin tapping the large healthy trees that you have access to. All right, let's talk equipment. So the first thing you need in order to drill a hole into your tree is a drill. I use this Ryobi hammer drill. It's a great all-around drill, all types of projects around the house. Definitely needs to be cordless, really awesome stuff. So you're ready to drill your holes. So you want to drill 1 to 2 inches in, nice and steady, and all the way out nice and steady just once to minimize the damage to the tree. So now that your hole is drilled, you want to take your spile or tap, use a rubber mallet to tap them into the tree. Once you get tapping, you'll feel once the tap is fully nested in the hole that you drilled. Okay, so I use 2 different taps for this project, the more traditional metal tap here and this plastic tap. Now I prefer the plastic taps for several reasons. One, that the diameter of the plastic tap is less than that of the metal tap. And again, that reduces the damage that you're doing to the tree. And the other thing that I like about these plastic taps is that you can attach a hose to the bottom here so that when the sap runs down, it runs down in a completely covered environment to protect them from insects getting inside or other animals like squirrels and raccoons getting into your sap. It's important to have that bucket sealed. So that's why I prefer the plastic taps over the metal taps, but both work just fine. So you've drilled your hole, you put in your taps, you're collecting sap, but what does the sap run into? For the plastic spiles, I use a 5-gallon food grade bucket, which works great. It's able to hold a lot of sap, but it's also important to have backups. So for every tap that I put into a tree, I have 2 5-gallon buckets to collect the excess and store cold so that the sap doesn't spoil or overflow. So my recommendation is to go with the plastic taps with 5-gallon sealed and covered buckets, and you should be good to go. So once you start collecting sap, you're going to want to make sure that the sap stays cold, 40 degrees or less. As you saw in part 1, I had a rotation of buckets that I put into our chest freezer and pulled out when I needed more storage, but that way the sap stayed cold. You can freeze sap for up to 6 months and boil it whenever you need to. So real maple syrup is expensive primarily because it requires a lot of fuel to evaporate water out of the sap to concentrate it into maple syrup. So once you've collected enough sap to begin boiling, I highly recommend that you boil the sap outside rather than inside. Work with what you have, but just know that if you're going to be boiling inside, it's going to take a lot longer and your energy bill is probably going to go up. For my boiling, I went with a 2-burner propane stove and an 8-quart Dutch oven and a food tray on the other burner. And the upshot here is you want to select a boiling vessel that has a high surface area to volume ratio. The idea here is that you want to have a lot of surface area to boil off the water content of the sap. Tall, cylindrical boiling vessels work okay, but because there's a lot of volume and relatively less surface area, the boiling process is going to take a lot longer. Once you boil down the sap to a color that starts to resemble maple syrup, you're going to want to bring that pre-syrup inside and finish it on the stove. You're going to need finer heat control to make sure that you don't cook your syrup where it starts to turn into maple sugar. For my maple sap finishing, I went with the Made-In 4-quart saucepan. I absolutely love this pan. It's high quality, well built, not cheap, but it's probably the last saucepan I will ever buy. Pick one up. You won't be sorry. All right, so once you boil down your sap into maple syrup, you're going to want to filter that hot syrup to remove any impurities. As you saw in part 2, I ended up using a coffee filter, which I don't recommend because that filter is a little bit too fine and ended up collecting a lot of sugars and slowing down the process. So I would use a proper maple syrup filter, which you can buy in the link below, and a fry oil stand that you can place the filter inside of and allow this process to go a lot smoother than it did for me. The last thing you'll need are storage containers for your syrup. I highly recommend 1-quart or 1-pint mason jars with fresh lids that will seal and allow you to keep your maple syrup shelf stable. And that's really it. It's not terribly complicated. You don't have a lot of specialized equipment to purchase, and the whole process is pretty intuitive. Okay, so before we talk about money and time costs, I want to discuss why I call this series Sugaring While Black. And I want to start by asking you all a question. How many black people do you know make homemade maple syrup? I'll wait. Go ahead, do a Google search. No, I'll be right here. Find anyone? Yeah, I didn't either. And so I think it's really important we talk about homesteading, we talk about the outdoors, we talk about nature, that we're paying special attention to the fact that even though black folks are out here doing all of these things, we oftentimes aren't represented or associated with these sorts of activities. So my hope is that by being explicit about the fact that I am a black person making homemade maple syrup, it creates a sense of comfort and connection with black folks who are already doing these sorts of things, or black folks who are thinking about doing these sorts of things, but may not feel like it's something for them. Okay, before I talk about the monetary costs, I want to talk about the time costs of making homemade maple syrup. The collecting process maybe takes a couple of minutes to set up, and then over the course of several weeks to maybe a month, you're just sitting back, collecting sap, pouring it off, and keeping it cold. Really not a big time commitment over the course of several weeks. Now, the boiling takes a fair amount of time. From start to finish, for the 3 batches of boiling that I did, it took between 8 to 12 hours. Making homemade maple syrup is not about long periods of active attention. It's about letting the processes that you've set up take its course. I would check on that sap maybe once or twice an hour. Now, when you bring the sap inside, that's when you're probably going to need about 1 to 2 hours of direct attention to make sure that the sap doesn't boil too much that it starts to crystallize. And if you don't know where that threshold point is, it sounds like this. So the time cost overall is not that much. Okay, in order for us to produce 5 liters of maple syrup from about 250 liters of maple sap, it cost us $520. Not cheap. Most of the money that we spent for this project was in the specialized equipment. We spent about $50 on taps, $150 on buckets, $150 on the 2-burner propane stove, $50 for the boiling tray that we used, and about $120 on fuel. So $520 to make 5 liters of maple syrup breaks down to about $104 per liter of maple syrup, which obviously is a lot more expensive than buying it in the store. So at the local food co-op, 1 liter of Michigan-produced maple syrup costs about $25. $25 versus $104. But like a lot of things that people get into in order to be more sustainable, the startup cost is going to be high, but the long-term cost is going to be comparable. So looking at next year, the cost of producing that same 5 liters of maple syrup is going to be less than it was in the first year. The only thing I'll need to pay for next year is fuel. So for those 5 liters of maple syrup that we produced, I used 3 tanks of propane. I had to buy 2 new tanks of propane, which cost me double what it was to refill that tank. So with a fuel cost of about $70, the cost to produce 1 liter of maple syrup from my yard will be about $15 as opposed to $25 from the liter that I can buy at the store. If you're able to pay the startup cost, you have a good chance of saving money in the long term and having the best tasting maple syrup you've ever had. I'd say that's worth it. But I didn't get into this just to save money. There's the environmental benefit of producing and harvesting food within the geography that you live. There's also very real benefit of connecting with other beings that you share space with, which is a concept and a way of thinking that I learned from indigenous scholars like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who talk about the ways that indigenous people on Turtle Island think about the other beings that they share space with. And it's also a way to honor the people who stewarded the land before my family and I and our lineages got here. Another benefit is, all right, we've tapped some trees. What do you think, dude?
Good.
Yeah? So if I'm able to teach them environmental literacy, teaching them the skills of being self-sufficient in producing something so delicious that can come from the land that they live on and not necessarily from a grocery store, I think these are all really important lessons that not only my children, but other young people should learn and practice. And I guess the last benefit is that this process or this project has enabled me to connect with other people like you watching. This has been such an amazing project, one that I plan to continue for years to come. We ended up sharing most of the maple syrup that we produce with friends, and that's another way to build connection and build community around things that we all enjoy. So if you're thinking about making homemade maple syrup, I highly encourage you to do so. All right, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode of Out There JCH.